Well, welcome back, everyone. And for those of you that are just joining us today for the first time for the keynote, we want to welcome all of you back to day 2. We're so excited that you all could join us, and we're definitely excited for you to be here for what is sure to be an excellent keynote address. A couple of reminders, as you notice at the top left corner of the Zoom. This session is being recorded, and we are offering closed caption through otter.ia. So you can go to that link if you'd like to do closed caption. Also, a reminder that the PD sessions that follow this will begin at 3:30 p.m. Central Time after a 15-minute break after this keynote session. And if you're ever in question about the appropriate times for the sessions, the website is the master schedule. So go to the NSTA website and you can't go wrong on those times, just in case there happens to be a typo somewhere else. As a reminder for this keynote session, for the last 15 minutes of each of our keynote sessions, attendees will have the opportunity to go into randomly assigned breakout rooms to discuss and connect with other attendees. And for those of you that were here yesterday, I think we'd all agree that that went really well. It was like a cool virtual hallway experience. So I encourage all of you to go to those breakouts and participate in those follow-up discussions. We hope this will add a little extra networking opportunity, as well as a chance to hear others' thoughts on the keynote address. And with that, I would like to now introduce today's speaker. Alex Shevrin Venet is an educator, author, and professional development facilitator based in Vermont. She teaches at the Community College of Vermont, Antioch University New England, and Castleton University. Previously, she was a teacher and leader at Centerpoint School, an alternative therapeutic school near Burlington, Vermont. Her professional areas of focus are trauma-informed teaching, learning, and systems change, and social emotional learning. She believes in building and sustaining the classroom community. Alex believes that all students need a safe and caring school environment, and that we can create this environment through unconditional positive regard, recognizing the dynamic and complex lives of our students. And after this keynote, when you're wanting to read even more from Alex, her first book, Equity-Centered Trauma-Informed Education, is now available from W.W. Norton. It is my pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker. Her message entitled, "What Can One Coach Really Do About Trauma? Transforming Our Teams with Trauma-Informed Education." Alex, it's all yours.
Hi, everyone. How's it going? Say hi in the chat. I love a lively chat. So if that doesn't distract you, I encourage you to keep it open and feel free to ask questions, react, say, wow, Alex, that joke was so funny. So feel free to chat it up in the chat. I'm so excited to be here to talk about this issue, which I know is important to me and I know is important to a lot of you. So let's get started. So thank you for the great introduction. Just a couple other things about me. I'm zooming at you from beautiful Winooski, Vermont, which is right outside of Burlington. I am from Lexington, Massachusetts, where my brother was a policy debater. So I only have, like some memories from 20 years ago of like listening to him, do the practicing and all the big tubs of his research and everything. But I have fond memories of how much debate meant to him. And so I'm excited to be speaking with you all. If anyone wants to connect with me, best way to do it is on Twitter. I'm always on Twitter. And so my handle's there if anybody wants to chat. So with that, we're going to do two things to get ourselves ready to learn. The first is that we're going to just take a second, a mindful moment to check in with ourselves. what I'm going to do is just turn off my camera for about 30 seconds. I would invite you to do the same if your camera's on. I have a list of things on the screen you might choose to do, or you might just sit there, whatever you feel like you need to do to sort of shake off your day so far and be here now. So I'm going to turn off my camera. I'll call us back together in about 30 seconds. All right, we'll come back together. You all probably have a better internal clock than I do. I never timed that, so I think that was 30 seconds. All right, the next thing we're going to do when we start learning together, we have to feel connected to the other people we're learning with. And so I'd love to invite you all to check in the chat. And so today's check-in is on a scale of 1 to 9 on this rubber duck scale. How are you doing today? And you can just drop the number, or you can go ahead and drop a reason along with your number. So I will model aloud, and then you can go ahead and check in the chat. I am feeling like a 3 today. I'm mostly inflated. There's a couple obstacles in my way, but I'm going to keep sailing forward. All right. I'm seeing a range in the chat. Lots of 2s. That's awesome. I saw one about getting your back to school supplies. That's always make you feel like a fully inflated giant rubber duck. I love using this check-in with students because it can give you a real sense, right, of the stress level. And if they're a number 9, right, that's your little cue to do some more checking in. All right. Beautiful. Thank you, everyone. Okay. So then my last kind of getting started piece here is a reminder to take what you need. And by that, I mean a couple of things. One is that, whenever you're doing online learning, it can be easy to just sort of feel really glued to the screen. You sort of lose track of how your body is doing, how you're doing. I just want to encourage everybody that if you need to, if we were in a room together, I would say, oh, it's okay if you sit instead of stand or walk around the back of the room or anything like that. So just my invitation, I can't tell what you're doing. So don't forget to make yourself comfortable if you can, and sort of take what you need to feel well. The second piece is we're going to be talking about trauma, and that can bring up stuff, even if you don't necessarily feel like it's going to, or you go, oh yeah, I'm fine talking about this topic. It can just stir things up. And so I always encourage folks to pay attention to how you're responding. And if you're finding that things have been kind of stirred up, make sure you reach out to your support networks. All right, so let's dive in. So today's topic is, what can one coach really do about trauma? And this was the topic I landed on for today because I'm sure that you all have been pretty tuned into a lot of the discourse about education these days, right? Of there's so much trauma. How are we going to deal with all the pandemic trauma coming back into school? We need to be trauma informed, all this stuff. And as individual coaches, educators, we can kind of feel like, whew, that's a lot. There is a lot happening. What am I really supposed to do about it from my little role? And so the answer that I want to give you today is you should do nothing and you can do everything. So we're going to unpack that a little bit, but that's really where we're going to lean into, is this both and, that what can one coach really do about trauma? Well, you can't really do much, and you can do a heck of a lot. So we're going to sort of unpack and dig into that today. But to get started with, we have to go back to our definitions, right, about what trauma is. There are a lot of definitions to trauma, and in putting together my own definition, I was really struck by, carving through all the research and looking at all the different fields that contribute to how we understand trauma. There's all kinds of really different explanations. And so the one that I'm going to offer here is pretty expansive and tries to capture a lot. And these words that are on the right-hand side are just there to sort of remind us that there are a lot of elements of trauma, dimensions of trauma. People look at it from a neuroscience field. They look at it from sociology. They look at it from history, from indigenous studies. They look at it from a medical treatment model. There's all these different ways of understanding trauma. And so this definition is intended to be big and try to capture as much as I can out of all of that. So with that big asterisk, right, trauma can be both an individual and or collective response to life-threatening events, harmful conditions, or a prolonged, dangerous, or stressful environment. So you may think about trauma as resulting from sort of big one and done events, right? Like a natural disaster or being assaulted or something else kind of big, scary and happens one time. But trauma actually can also result from life-threatening or harmful conditions, right? So persistently living through a stressful environment, such as an unsafe home or an unsafe school, or just to give a totally random example, a global pandemic. So those ongoing conditions, right, that may not on any given day feel completely overwhelming, but as they accumulate, right, it can have that same impact. And sort of, what we might consider like low-level stress on a day-to-day can eventually become overwhelming. And so part of what I'm trying to get at with this expansive definition is that what you might think of as the trauma that your students have experienced, you might point to some of them and say, well, I know that student's experienced trauma because I know about, what's gone on in their family, or I know this student's experienced trauma because we had wildfires and that was traumatic for a lot of us. But there's a lot that we don't necessarily see or we don't necessarily know about because trauma is pretty subjective. So a way I like to explain this is to think about being at the ocean and you go swimming and there's a big wave that comes over you and the undertow is kind of pulling you and it's hard for you to get out of the water. So if you are a pro surfer, then you probably have a lot of experience with exactly the situation. You probably have been trained on how to get yourself out. You probably have the wisdom to look back and recognize that you have gotten out of this situation before. You probably have a community of buddies who also have their own stories about getting pulled in by the undertow. You can kind of compare notes. So this situation might be stressful, but not traumatic for you. It didn't overwhelm your capacity to deal with it. So not all stress is trauma, right? However, think about this instead. You're 3 years old. It is your very first time at the beach. The wave comes over you. You don't really know how to swim. You haven't been through this before. You have not talked about this with anybody, and maybe you don't even have the verbal skills to really talk about this with others. And maybe when you come out of the water, you lost your family on the beach, you feel really scared. That situation could cause trauma to a kid in that situation. I just said in that situation twice in the same sentence, so dock my points if you need to. But so what I'm saying here, right, is that trauma is so contextual, and there are so many factors that contribute to whether we experience something stressful as traumatic. And so with the pandemic, for example, a lot of people, I would say most people, experience the pandemic as stressful, but not everybody experienced the pandemic as traumatic, right? That's going to depend a whole lot on your specific experience, whether you had loved ones that got sick or died, whether you got sick, whether you had the support and resources around you to manage, whether you were able to make sense of it. And so as students are returning this year, there's going to be a whole range of experiences. And so it's important to remember that the trauma isn't the wave, the trauma is that response to the wave. And so as we're thinking about being trauma informed, one of the things I just like to remind people is we kind of have to let go of the idea that we could really identify who's experienced trauma and who hasn't because there's not really a great way to do that, right? I like to say that trauma is a lens, not a label. So if you've heard of trauma-informed education before, you may have heard it in this context of we have to figure out who are the trauma kids and then give them some extra support. We need to do some mindfulness. We need to do some extra resources so that those kids who experience trauma, so they have some support. And certainly an element of trauma-informed education is some extra support for people that we know for a fact have experienced trauma because they told us about it. But it's more expansive than that, right? Because if we recognize the trauma is not the wave, the trauma is the response, and then we recognize that kids, youth, teens, they're not going to tell you everything, right? Like they're not famously known for being super forthcoming about their inner world. And so we kind of have to let go of the idea that we can really know who's experienced trauma. And so as you're thinking about your team, as you're thinking about your classes, I want people to move away from the idea of trying to categorize in your head who's experienced trauma and how do I help them, and instead look at how do I actually shift the whole culture of what I'm doing so that this would be supportive for all students, whether or not they've experienced trauma, and so that it helps build in some of the buffers that would support someone from experiencing stress as trauma in the future. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a second, and we'll get into that in my breakout in a moment as well. So another important piece to understand as we're sort of looking at what is trauma is the impact of trauma, right? So there's sort of an old belief about trauma that kids are resilient. Kids will just get over it. Trauma is hard, but if you just power through it, then everything will be okay, right? It's been pretty definitively proven at this point that those things are not true, right? Like kids are resilient, that's certainly true. But resilience in the academic research on child resilience is a factor of the community around a kid and their access to resources. So kids are not necessarily inherently so resilient they'll just get through anything. They're resilient when we, the adults, build that community around them. Trauma also can have really lasting impacts that range from everything from what you might think of as sort of social and emotional impacts like anxiety, depression, a hard time making and keeping friends, to some kind of cognitive effects like having a hard time with long-term memory, with recall, both of which I know are important in this field, with processing, with executive functioning, all of those types of cognitive effects. And increasingly, there's a ton of evidence that emotional trauma can cause physical impacts, not just in the moment, but you certainly would see that, but also throughout the lifespan. You're seeing negative health outcomes across the lifespan for people who experience trauma in childhood. And so when we say to kids, oh, everyone goes through hard stuff, you'll be fine, we're kind of minimizing that. Actually, that's not always true. And this is a tricky, I'm going to come back to this idea of both and a lot, that holding of the complexity, because this is tricky, right? We don't want to say to a young person, oh, you experienced something traumatic. Well, guess the rest of your life is messed up now, right? Like we don't want to say, oh, you're doomed because you experienced something hard. And at the same time, both and we don't want to say, oh, you'll be fine, it'll all be okay, right? Because the reality is that's just not always true. And so we kind of have to navigate through the middle and recognize that kids can be okay if we, the adults, create that web of resilience around them. And then my last point sort of under what is trauma is that I've been talking to this point about youth, about kids, your students, but we also have to kind of break down this idea that trauma in schools is just a thing that impacts the kids. And I'm pulling here a little bit from the work of Dr. Elizabeth Dutro, who's amazing. If anybody's interested in trauma-informed education, highly recommend her work. She talks about this idea that there is no healer-healed dichotomy. There is no traumatized, non-traumatized dichotomy between teachers and students, because teachers can offer healing and teachers also need to be healed. Students can offer healing and students also need to be healed. Students experience trauma, adults experience trauma. To bring back our totally random example, you may have experienced a global pandemic as traumatic. You may also have experienced your school's response to the global pandemic as traumatic, right? This has been a hard freaking couple of years, right? And not all stress is trauma, right? It's the response to the wave, it's not the wave, but we all went underneath the wave. And if you are carrying some trauma with you into this fall, you're not alone. This is super common. And so when we think about how are we transforming schools, classrooms, teams in a trauma-informed lens, one of those steps to me is really recognizing that this is all of us together. This isn't just let's fix the kids, right? This is how do we make our schools and these activities more supportive to all of us, because we have all gone through this. So that kind of brings us to what is trauma-informed education. And like I mentioned before, there are a lot of perspectives about what trauma-informed education is. And in some ways that's great because no one owns the phrase trauma-informed education, right? Like there's no organization that's going to sell it to you. Like you don't have to buy trauma-informed education curriculum or anything. But it also means that we're all talking a little bit about different things. And so what I'm going to share is my definition of trauma-informed education. And I'm really coming from that expansive mindset where it's a lens, not a label. We're not picking out the trauma kids and doing something different, but we're being informed by trauma and making some transformations within our education systems. So that's really the core of it, right? It's right in the phrase, informed by trauma. What I sometimes recommend to individual teachers is just become a nerd about trauma, and that will really guide you into what you should do. And this may be really similar to how you coach, right? Dig deep into the information, and that will help lead you to your argument, right? Become really curious about this topic, and you will find out what to do. And so I'm going to distill in a couple seconds here some of the things that I think are, some of the big takeaways. But really, there's no checklist, there's no program. It's really about if I use trauma as a lens, then how does that change what I do in school? And so what I'm going to offer is a couple of those changes that I see as necessary based on all that I have learned by becoming a big nerd about trauma. So this brings us back to our question of what can you really do about trauma? So I want to start with this idea that you can do nothing. And I don't mean this in the sense of you can do nothing, so just don't bother at all. But I mean this in the sense of a little bit of being trauma informed is simply just being a person, just be a human. And that shouldn't sound radical, but I'm talking to a group of educators, and you know that our school systems sometimes force you to act in ways that are not about being a person, right? You have to sometimes treat kids like numbers. You have to worry about scores. You have to worry about how to get through the massive amount of students that you see each day. And so being a person isn't as simple as it can sound, but sometimes that's really at the heart of it, right? So if we see trauma as something that we all experience and not a deficit, it is not something that means you are broken. It is not something that only certain kids experience, but it's really part of our shared human experience. Then just being a person is trauma informed, right? Centering your humanity, showing up for your kids, your students, your young people in as equal of a way as you can, given that there's a power dynamic, right? So just showing up for each other. There's also an element of doing nothing where we recognize that somebody's experience of trauma is way bigger than their time in school or their time in high school or their time on your team, right? I'm sure that many of you know or are an adult who went through something as a kid and never ever talked about it at all until well into adulthood, or maybe not even now, right? People experience stuff when they're young that they either don't recognize as trauma, or they do and they're not really ready to deal with it, or they're not safe enough to unpack it. And so sometimes when people get interested in trauma-informed education, they get this enthusiasm like, I'm going to help kids process their trauma. I'm going to help them overcome it. They're going to, learn all these social emotional skills with me. And that energy is great. I love the energy. Keep it coming. And if we recognize that some kids are just not going to go there with us, right? They are not going to touch on the topic. They are not going to open up. High school, middle school is not going to be the time when they unpack all this stuff. Then we sort of recognize that we're just going to be one piece of the puzzle, right? We're going to be able to show up for them in meaningful ways, but we're not going to get this big movie ending of, debate team member overcomes trauma, hero coach save the day, right? So we have to instead kind of be humble and recognize that we're just one piece of the puzzle, which is why I also talk a lot about systems change, right? If we all become one piece of the puzzle, we're doing a lot. And then the last piece of doing nothing is really just keeping doing the things that you're doing that are already trauma informed. So a lot of the research on trauma comes back to one core idea, which is that relationships with caring adults is what helps young people heal from trauma. And there is all kinds of, research about it's everything from, really meaningful reciprocal relationships all the way down to, there's this really interesting piece of research that I just love from Dr. Bruce Perry, who some of you may know his name. He's one of the big experts on child trauma. And something that his team looked at was, what is the right amount of therapeutic time for a kid recovering from trauma? So should they sit with their therapist once a week for 50 minutes? Should they do 3 20-minute sessions spread out across the week? What is going to help heal them? And they're looking at this from a neuroscience perspective. And what they found was that what kids actually needed from a neuroscience perspective was 3 or 4 small positive interactions per hour with anybody. So they call these therapeutic moments. And a therapeutic moment could be high-fiving somebody. It could be just looking somebody in the eye and authentically saying, how are you doing? Could be, reading a book to someone. It could be asking someone genuinely about their weekend. It could be remembering something they told you. And so really just having a bunch of those moments during your day was proved as effective as or more than sitting in an actual therapy session. And again, the idea there was that if a small moment of stress can change how your brain functions, so can a small, intense moment of positive connection. And so that's one of the areas that's shown to be really effective for kids with trauma. Having academic successes and having high expectations held for you and feeling a sense of efficacy and agency is important. And students who are on your teams are doing that by virtue of your leadership. Being in community, having lots of different relationships. I remember when my brother was doing debate, he had his team at school, but he also built so many great friendships with people he met at the summer program or going to competitions. Anything you're doing to expand the number of relationships and the quality of relationships for students, that's already being trauma informed. So when I say you can do nothing, I don't mean like quit your job and go live in a cave and you're helping save the world. But I mean, by doing what you are already doing and by being humble about your role, that is one of the things that you can do about trauma. But you can also do everything. And by everything, I mean that there are layers to what we can do to actually address and disrupt trauma. And I'll briefly go through these layers. And we'll be unpacking these more in my other session. So in schools and in programs, all the ways that we're interacting with youth, we can address the impact of trauma that has already happened. We can prevent trauma from happening in our schools and programs, and we can disrupt the things that cause future trauma. So we start with that level of addressing the impacts of trauma. So, and please appreciate my cat stock photography that are going to go with these, because I worked really hard on it. So by addressing the impacts of trauma, I mean, when you learn about trauma and how it impacts the brain, how it impacts emotions, how it impacts youth, we want to make sure our spaces are sensitive to that. We want to make our schools a soft place to land. And by that, I don't mean that you have to become super touchy-feely. I don't mean that you have to not hold high expectations. You should hold high expectations. But I mean that thing about being human-centered that I mentioned before, right? Something I sometimes will ask of teachers is, picture the hardest day of your life and what you needed during that time. And most of the time people answer and they say, I needed flexibility. I needed people to check in on me. I needed help with some basic stuff like food or cleaning my house. I needed people to be patient with me, right? It's just that, right? You know, and obviously there's more to it. There's things that you can get into about sensory needs and regulation and different ways of doing discipline and all that stuff. But it's really about just showing up as a person without knowing necessarily that your student needs it. So this gets back to that tricky piece, right? That we can't exactly know who's experienced trauma. So it's about sort of offering that flexibility, even if the student doesn't tell you why they need it. It's about making our schools places where if you're having a hard time, this is a community that shows up for you, as opposed to a place that you want to avoid. And so this is a beautiful thing for your teams, because I think a lot of you might relate to the idea that your team, your class is kind of that safe place to land for some of your students, right? Within a bigger school system, you create these wonderful connected places where students feel like they can show up and lean on each other and get that support. And so that addressing the impacts is sort of making that a priority. And then, of course, you know, if you want to look more into some of the neuroscience stuff, some of the sensory stuff, there are those pieces as well. The next layer here is preventing trauma. So often when people talk about trauma-informed education, they use some euphemisms about, oh, trauma in kids' home lives, their chaotic homes, their neighborhoods. And what they're kind of saying without saying it is that we're blaming trauma on the parents and on the communities. It happens out there, and then they come through the magical force field of school and everything's great. That's not true, right? Trauma happens inside of schools because schools are a place where people are and where society is, and trauma happens among people and in society. So we know that trauma can happen in schools, bullying, harassment, school violence, some kids who go through schools where there's an extreme culture about high stakes testing and college achievement can experience trauma through that persistent, stressful environment. And then we also know, right, that anytime, you know, there's events, competitions, after school, all of those things can be present in those times as well. And so one of the things we can do to do something about trauma is to really look carefully at how trauma might be happening within our schools, within our teams, within competitions, and try to address that. And I know that throughout this conference, you're also talking about unpacking issues of anti-racism and equity, and you know, all those different dynamics that could also be contributing to trauma, or that we could be really disrupting. And so a question that I often will pose to schools is to answer, how is trauma present in your school? And then unpacking that question can really help us look at where can we get started in disrupting it. So if I can understand where trauma is happening, then I can start to do some things to disrupt it. So then the final layer here is looking at some broader impacts, and my my cat stock photo, I'm getting at like a butterfly effect type of feeling with this cat, all right? Uh, and this is really big, but I think also this is right in the wheelhouse of all of you. One way that we can look at trauma as a lens in schools is understanding that trauma in most cases is caused by systems of oppression. So what I mean by that is that interpersonal trauma, for example, from racism or sexism or transphobia, isn't just like a random one-off interaction between two people. It thrives in a culture where those systems of oppression exist. And one of the most powerful things we can do as educators is figure out, from my role, how could I be disrupting some of those bigger systems that go on to create trauma? And this feels very like big, I think, and abstract sometimes, but this is what we all do, right? And I think this is something we often sign up for. You know, we say, I became a teacher, I became a coach because I want to help create democratic citizens. I want to help students feel ready for the world. I want to help them be thinkers and be inquisitive, you know, so we're already thinking that big stuff. And so within the trauma-informed education lens, this is looking at how could I specifically think about what causes trauma in the world and how can I support my students to be disruptors? How can I support them to think about how they speak up when they witness injustice? How can I support them to show up for each other in kind and caring ways? How might I use this really beautiful structure of speech and debate to help them have the skills that they could use to advocate for people and to center the needs of marginalized people and to amplify voices? So this is your wheelhouse, right? This is exactly what you do in your teams and is a really beautiful part of trauma-informed education. So we come, as we wind to a close, we come back to this idea of both and, which is the idea that, you know, we have to hold these complexities together. So I'm not saying that, you know, you solely are responsible for the existence of trauma and injustice, but you can influence quite a lot from your position and from your role. If you think about that butterfly effect, if you think about being able to really make sure that on my team, in my classes, we are really being attentive to the levels of stress, to the potentially traumatic situations. If you're paying close attention to how you show up for students who are going through hard times, that's a lot of things you can do. That is quite a lot that you can influence. And you can also decide to lean into the complexity and to embrace the mess. So, you know, part of trauma-informed education to me is just that understanding that there is so little in this life that is cut and dry, and trauma is key among those things, right? It is so subjective. There are so many perspectives, and the young people that we work with every day are going to experience this really differently. And so there are no checklists, there is no 10-step plan I'm going to leave you with. But I find that when I really just decide I'm going to center humanity, I'm going to lead with care, and I'm just going to embrace that it's going to look messy, that helps carry me through it. And so we come again to this idea that what can you do about trauma as one person? Well, you can do nothing. You can keep doing the things that you're doing, which in a sense are already trauma informed. You're such an important part of that student's network of support. You are one of those caring adults who is really going to be helping them, whether they tell you that they need that or not. And you can do everything. You can make a huge difference through your focus on equity, through your focus on justice, through those high expectations, the academic skills. All of those things are really quite significant. And so my closing words to you are really that just to remember that you can do something when you hear about oh, so much trauma coming out of the pandemic. Oh, there's going to be all these social emotional needs. What are we going to do? Remember that part of what we're going to do is that you're going to do something. You can pick any one of those levels. You can pick any one of those areas and just get started. You don't have to do it all, and you shouldn't do it all alone, but you can start somewhere. And so what can you do about trauma? Nothing and everything, but I encourage you to pick somewhere to get started. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you very much.
All right, we're going to be moving into our hallway discussions now. And I think Alex gave us a lot to think about in these discussions about getting started and what that looks like. So Lauren, I'll leave it up to you to make the magic happen. Thanks again, Alex.